solemnly swore an oath to God to protect his name, his followers, and his kingdom. The military orders of the Crusades answered the call when threat of annihilation was hanging in the balance. In an all-new series, James and Joanna Bogle discuss the heroic efforts of the defense of ancient Christendom.
Europe is attacked from the north, from the south, from the east, and from the northeast as well. We really, literally had attacks on all sides.
So arose the military orders and the Crusades, an all-new series here on the Global Catholic Network, EWTN.
Hello and welcome to the Military Orders and the Crusades. I'm Joanna Bogle, and with my husband Jamie we're exploring this chapter of our Catholic history. Today we're going to look at the Knights Templar. So we're back in the 11th century, and this is further to the Christian conquest of Jerusalem. It's been won back after a terrible battle with the Islamic forces. And there's been a tragedy about that, but we're now in the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, or Outremer, which was the word that was used at the time.
Yes, a French word meaning literally over the seas. And what we see after the establishment of the Latin Kingdom, which lasted for 100 years, is an attempt to reproduce Christian civilization again in Palestine as it had been under the Byzantine Roman Empire since, well, for many hundreds of years before the advent of the Islamic conquests. And we have the full range of Christian civilization. The lands are divided up in the normal system of the feudal system, lords and ladies and barons of various property and territories within the Latin Kingdom and the other kingdoms. But what we needed at that time to see, in order to establish a full defence of the Latin Kingdom, was a permanent force, a dedicated, committed force, and this is where the military religious orders come in. First of all, they are essentially based upon a monastic ideal, but they're not monks, they are religious knights, although some people have called them the monks of war, understandably. And what they are is a very elite force, dedicated to their task, obviously unmarried, with no other commitments save the defence of the kingdom and the holy places. And the most famous of these are the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. The full name of the Templars is the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, Pauperes Commemorationes Christi Templique Solomonici. And the reason that they're called of the Temple of Solomon is because that is the property that they were initially given as their headquarters, right next door to the Temple of Solomon, as they thought. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, as it became Temple Mount, as it is sometimes known. And that is where they headquartered themselves. What their initial purpose was consisted in protecting the pilgrims that came to the holy places. Because
we're still here in a situation where there has been much war, and there are really, I suppose you could say, bandits marauding around, and so ordinary travellers, pilgrims to Jerusalem, but any ordinary traveller, I mean the trade routes and so on, would be subject to, as it were, local warlords or gangs of bandits in this area.
That's right. And it was always a problem for pilgrims travelling from Christian Europe. They were liable to be attacked by bandits and slaughtered, not necessarily just Muslims, but any other kind of bandit en route. And so they needed protection, and this was partly what the task of the Knights Templar was.
And let's get this clear. The Knights Templar are vowed to poverty, they are dedicated, they are unmarried, they have a monastic quality about them. So we need to be absolutely clear this was a religious order, something unique, something quite different from our understanding of an ordinary soldier, and absolutely different from somebody who just takes it upon himself to hang around and try and help people.
Exactly. Well, this is why St. Bernard calls them the new order of knights, and he writes his treatise, as we saw at the beginning of this series, De Laude Novae Militiae, in praise of the new knighthood, or the new army of knights. Because for the first time we see a familiar ideal, the ideal of monastic life, married together with an equally familiar ideal, and that is the ideal of the knight, the military life, defending Christendom. We have a rather rosy view these days, perhaps, in which we forget human nature, and we forget fallen human nature particularly, and imagine that a Christian civilization which is built upon love, upon charity, upon fraternal relations, which of course it must be, but that somehow this alone will sustain it, even from outside attack. The reality, of course, is that in this fallen world you have to defend yourself sometimes. And that is what happened in the Latin Kingdom. Not only did the pilgrims need protecting, but the kingdom itself needed defending. And it needed very disciplined, very committed defence to be able to withstand some of the attacks which it was coming under. And for that, this new ideal was devised by the first master of the temple, Hugh de Payen, and his relative Godfrey de Saint-Omer. And they set up effectively what became recognised as a religious order based upon the rule of Saint Benedict, because they themselves were inspired by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, a Cistercian abbot there, the Cistercian abbot of Clairvaux, who himself, in the Cistercian rule, predicated his life and his order on the rule of Saint Benedict.
So this is something that modern Catholics can understand, since the Benedictines flourish to this day, and the rule of St. Benedict is extremely popular, not least because the present Holy Father has taken his name, and all of us are familiar with that idea, the vows that you take, the living in community. And there was this idea, Benedictine again in its essence, of poverty, exemplified by the Templars with their rather unusual device, their rather unusual logo, we might say today, which showed two knights on a horse, two knights on one horse, because they were poor, they were going to be poor, so the idea was you would share your horse. In those days, the idea of a knight on his horse, a chevalier, literally using the French word, for a French word for horse, the knight and his own horse was an example of how you were doing rather well. So these are the two poor knights sharing even a horse.
And we can see in this representation of a Knight Templar in full armour and with the red cross on the white mantle. In the corner you will see the seal of the order, and there you have two knights sitting on one horse to emphasise poverty. Of course, they didn't go into battle with two knights on one horse, but the idea was to emphasise poverty. They begin in 1119. They are very quickly recognised as an important new foundation by the Church at the Council of Troyes. In 1129, they receive the official endorsement of the Church, and by 1139, so only a short time after their foundation, Pope Innocent II produces his bull Omne Datum Optimum, every best gift, which gives the order huge privileges, exempts them from local taxes, exempts them from all sorts of impositions, allows them to pass freely through all the borders of the Christian lands, and gives them a position of special prominence, which is virtually unknown to any other religious order, or any other group, or any other kingdom, or any other group of Christians, within a short space of time. This shows you how it was quickly recognised that such a unique form of social organisation was required to defend the holy places, and, let it not be forgotten, to defend the whole of Christendom. Because this effectively is a buffer zone, is a frontier for the whole of Christendom from the incursions from the East. Not only from Islam, but also from other incursions in due course. And this was, of course, quickly recognised as being an essential to the defence of Christendom as a whole.
And we've had this idea of poverty, and there was also this idea of purity, hence the white robe, and the idea of shedding your blood, hence the red. And this red cross on a white robe is, of course, really the symbol of the Crusaders that has come down to us,
yes,
hasn't it?
And the Templars eventually adopted as their primary symbol the red cross on the white background, and the Hospitallers had a white cross on a red background, which, of course, as the Order of Malta, they still have. So they became instantly distinctive. This was for the knights themselves. The other members of the order wore slightly different costumes. The order itself was divided, as was most of the military religious orders, because there weren't just the Templars and the Hospitallers, but also the Teutonic Knights. There were the Knights of St. Thomas, there were the Sword Brethren, there were a number of other crusading orders, military religious orders. But these two, possibly three if you can count the Teutonic Knights, were the most well-known and probably the most influential. And they consisted of, firstly, the knights themselves, who were equipped like the heavy cavalry of the Middle Ages with full armour. Then you had the sergeants, who were the kind of light cavalry, and were the, if you like, the other ranks of the order. So the knights are kind of officers and the sergeants were like the other ranks. The difference being that the knights themselves were the primary fighting force as a cavalry unit designed to charge with full armour. Then you had ranks of non-fighting members of the order, the serving brethren, who tended to be the administrators of the estates across Europe, under the command of either a retired knight or sergeant, or several knights and sergeants. And you had the chaplains. And the chaplains were to provide the sacraments, say Mass, for the order. But they were themselves members of the order, obedient to the master, later the Grand Master of the order. And this is how the structure of the military religious orders took place. So it was partly monastic. They had the life of the monastic life, hearing Mass, saying the office in a reduced form, because they were also a military organisation and were possessed of the full range of military discipline required to maintain a force that was going to be needed to defend the Holy Land and Christendom.
You can sort of see here the genesis of the modern Western idea of an army, where we too have chaplains, so soldiers don't go into battle without the benefit of prayers and the sacraments and so on. So there was this idea of the Christian military knight. And this gave this notion of chivalry to Western civilization. This is another subject, of course, there are many elements in that, but this image of the Crusader knight, and you still buy them today if you want to have little boys having soldiers, they will have the Crusader knight. He will probably be a Templar, won't he? He'll be wearing might be a Hospitaller, but mostly the Templar ones with the red cross seems to be the one that we would recognise as a Crusader.
You had the ideal of defending Christendom, and by implication those who could not defend themselves, the weak, the suffering, the sick, women and children. It is one that is deeply rooted in Christian tradition. It goes back long before the military religious orders, right the way back to the foundations of Christianity, in the words of our Lord himself or St. John the Baptist. But it comes to an apogee with the military religious orders and sets the tone for the whole of medieval Christendom, whereby the ideal of chivalry, of a knight dedicated to the defence of those who cannot defend themselves, and guided by a code of conduct which ensures that he attempts to maintain the highest standards at all times, becomes probably the primary leitmotif of the Middle Ages, together with, of course, the monastic ideal. And this is one of the lasting influences of the military religious orders.
And so although they have their foundation in the Holy Land, of course they have bases, let's say, across Europe, and some of these linger today.
They do. And the reason for this is because maintaining a force in Outremer, miles away from their homeland, required an enormous supply chain. It required resources, it required men, it required training, it required supplies, it required money. all of which necessitated, across the whole of Christian Europe, the setting up of commanderies and preceptories, precisely and solely designed to raise these necessary resources. And you have evidence of those to this very day, where you have names such as Hospital so-and-so, Temple so-and-so, like Templecombe, for example, or the Temple in Paris or the Temple in London. All of these are examples of estates that were extant in Christian Europe and grew enormously over a short space of time in order to fund and maintain the force that was defending the frontiers of Christendom.
And this is partly why you're interested, because you are a barrister of the Middle Temple, which is directly connected with that. The Temple Church still stands. And
indeed, I'm also a member of the Order of Malta. So I do have a personal interest in these things. But I think that it's also of interest to Christians generally, not just Catholics. And you can't really have a proper understanding of the history of Western Europe, or indeed Eastern Europe, unless you have an understanding of the enormous part that was played by the military religious orders. We see, for example, in Palestine to this day, their castles were so well built that they still stand. Safed, built in 1140, or Kerek de Moab, built in 1143. These are all Templar castles. Famously, Castle Pilgrim, built in 1217 on the sea coast to defend a strategic position. These are all still standing, or at least are very secure ruins, because they were so well built. And this is but one of the many legacies which are maintained to this day by the military religious orders.
So what happened? Tell us the story.
Well, interestingly, the number of, although we don't know exactly how many sergeants, or of course they had mercenaries that they employed as well, or they had auxiliary forces, but the number of knights who were the primary core of the order was never that great at any one time. Our contemporary tells us that there were 400 knights in Jerusalem at the zenith of their prosperity, only 400. So we're talking about a relatively small force of knights, larger one of sergeants, then auxiliaries, and perhaps mercenaries. But nevertheless, they were able to defend this frontier of Christendom from much larger armies. That in itself is an extraordinary story. And because of their discipline, their dedication, their skill as warriors, and their religious devotion, they were regarded as the elite force by the Muslims, and were more feared by the Muslims than any other Christian force.
And they acquired a lot of property because people used them as bankers because of this network they had across Europe.
Effectively, they were the first bankers, because what happened was, because they were given so many privileges, they effectively were in a position to accumulate more wealth to sustain the force on the frontiers. And they began from about 1150 to generate letters of credit for pilgrims journeying to the Holy Land, or indeed crusaders going to the Holy Land. Pilgrims deposited their valuables with a local Templar preceptory or commandery. Before embarking, they received a document indicating the value of their deposit, and they used that document and redeemed it upon arrival in the Holy Land from the Templars, or indeed the Hospitallers, in the Holy Land. And this arrangement effectively was a form of early banking.
They were really having checks, checkbooks, or even...
And letters of credit, yes. And they were able thereby to establish very considerable financial networks across the whole of Christendom, which again generated income for them, which again enabled them to buy large tracts of land, to build churches, castles, farms, vineyards. They involved in manufacturing, import and export. They owned fleets of ships. And they became a very considerable presence. That later caused people to be jealous of them, including some of the kings of Christendom, and we'll see what happened and what that led to later on. But at that stage, at the height of their power, this generated for them sufficient resources to enable them successfully to defend the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem and the frontiers of Christendom. But eventually the time came, as we've seen in the previous programs, where the Muslim forces managed to gather together, and once they had a charismatic, gifted leader like Salah ad-Din, they were then able to stand up to the Crusader forces. The Latin Kingdom itself, like so many kingdoms, Muslim, Christian, or of no particular fixed affiliation, inevitably suffered internal dissensions. Same applied to the Latin Kingdom. Guy de Lusignan, the king, one of the kings of the Latin kingdom, was not a very wise man. He was manipulated by some advisors. That led to the disaster of the Horns of Hattin, and that was a huge defeat, despite the tenacity of the Templars and the Hospitallers. Nonetheless, Salah ad-Din had a signal victory there, and we begin to see the tide starting to turn after the Battle of the Horns of Hattin. Salah ad-Din takes Jerusalem. The Crusaders recapture the city in 1229, but only briefly, because in 1244, Baybars, whom I mentioned, the Turkish Mamluk, with his Khwarezmi Turks, recaptures Jerusalem, and after he captured Jerusalem in 1244, Jerusalem was never retaken again by any Christian or Western forces, right up until 1917, when British forces captured it from the Ottoman Turks during the First World War under Field Marshal Lord Allenby.
Who rather nicely took the same idea that he didn't want to be regarded as the conqueror of Jerusalem. Didn't he insist on walking in?
Yes, he dismounted from his horse when he reached the gates of Jerusalem, just as the Emperor Heraclius had done when he restored the True Cross, and he walked into the city as a gesture, because he himself was, of course, a Christian. And this, again, was a recapturing of that romantic, chivalric ideal, which is personified by the ideals of the Crusader Knights, however much it may, in practice, not always have been lived up to. The result was that the Templars were forced to relocate to the seaport of Acre, which they held for the next century, but eventually that too fell to Baybars in 1291, the Siege of Acre, and the famous Siege of Acre. They then moved to Tortosa, which is now in Syria, and to Abflit, and then eventually they were forced out of the Holy Land altogether, moved to the island of Cyprus with their headquarters at Limassol, and eventually thereafter their wealth and privilege caused them to run into problems with some of the kings of Christendom, notably King Philip of France, and we'll hear about that in due course. So you have this order which is instantly recognizable with its white robe and red cross, with its tremendous dedication, and its cardinal rule that they were not permitted to surrender unless the Templar flag had fallen. And even then, they had to regroup with another of the military religious orders, usually the Hospitallers, and only after all the flags had fallen were they allowed to leave the battlefield. This uncompromising principle, along with their reputation for courage, excellent training, heavy armament, wealth of resources, made the Templars one of the most feared combat forces in medieval times. They also had, it's interesting to note, that they were the first to recover the famous Shroud of Turin, which became one of their most treasured possessions.
Yes, they had the name for it, didn't they? The Mandelion. And when people have been tracing the background to the Shroud of Turin, this has been a major part of the story. Of course, it would be worth saying that with this romantic and, one may say in the end, also tragic story, and we've already heard some of the tragedy, the slow retreat to Acre and so on, with this has come a great wealth of legends, and some viewers will be familiar with the name Templar, not because of this history, but because of the fantasy, and I'm thinking of the Da Vinci Code and its various imitators, and indeed its precursors.
Yes, and you also see various attempts to re-establish an order of the Temple of Jerusalem, or of Solomon. Many of them are just rather comical, farcical attempts to re-establish an order. But it does show the enduring nature of the ideals for which the Templars stood and represented. Then you get fanciful reinterpretations of them, like Dan Brown's rather absurd Da Vinci Code. But you also get, for example, the orders of various orders of Freemasons have some Templar titles and names within their rank structure, and I think, in a sense, one shouldn't be too concerned about that, because it's if you like, a tribute to the enduring nature of the ideal. And one of the things that is rather remarkable about the history of the real Templars is that undoubtedly they made some mistakes, sometimes foolish mistakes, but they are rarely accused of dishonourable deeds. Salah ad-Din himself even recognised this, and he is one of the more charismatic figures among the Muslim leaders. Likewise, the Hospitallers. Whilst you do get some, obviously the absurd popular crusades that resulted in some disasters, and you also get foolish mistakes and worse made by some of the secular leaders, the lay leaders, and it has to be said by some of the clergy who insist upon mistakes being made. I mean, they don't see them as mistakes, but that's what they are. For example, at the time of the siege of Cairo, the whole of Palestine was offered by Al-Kamil if the siege would be lifted, but the ecclesiastical representative refused it with disastrous results. But what you see consistently with the Templars and the Hospitallers is a real honouring of their ideals, such that even their enemies rarely accuse them of dishonourable deeds, although of course they make sure that they do away with them if they're captured, partly because they fear their very zeal.
So in this story of the Crusades, with some chapters of dishonour and so on, here is something that is worthy of note and interestingly has come down to us as such. Yes. Has come down to us as such, this ideal of sacrifice and heroism and nobility. And it's a comparatively small band against a much larger foe. So there are many elements here that are very noble, something that was well worth exploring, and as you've said, has had therefore many imitators and so on. Something that's not going to go away. We've been looking at the military orders and the Crusades. Join us next time when we explore another religious order, the Knights Hospitaller. The military orders and the Crusades, a chapter of Christian history.